Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adam Meyers. As Caitlin mentioned, I am Director of Litigation with Communities Resist. We are a nonprofit law office. Nonprofit law office operating in North Brooklyn. We work largely with associations and other community groups to fight displacement, harassment, and the other ills that tenant associations have to fight these days. My co-presenter, Bruno, is our coalition organizer, and he, I'm an attorney. He comes from a background of working, and so we're going to try to rent strikes from the, these two different angles on it. I just want to echo what Kayla said. Please, you're all muted, and so I guess we're going to be talking for an hour and a half to a room like devoid of auditory feedback, and I'm a little bit nervous about this. So if you can like make those little digital signals at us or chat at us or something like that, let us know if you've got questions that we need to address, faster, slower, that would all be extraordinarily helpful. And I will try to keep my eye on the chat stuff as we go. Now I'm going to try to share my screen. And so I think I've done it. Can everybody give me a thumbs up if they see my screen? Sorry. Excellent. Good use of the thumbs up response feature. So we're presenting today. We're really preaching the gospel today of the rent strike and its value as a really powerful tool, a tool for giving a building something to organize around, a tool for allowing a group of tenants to come together and exert some real economic pressure on their landlords in order to realize their goals. Maybe those goals are repairs, maybe those goals have to do with harassment or lease renegotiation or all sorts of things, and rent strikes can help us get there. And so what are we going to be talking about today? We've broken our presentation down into a number of little subsections. We're going to start off by saying a bit about the history of rent strikes, which is long and storied and pretty interesting. We're going to talk about some of the legal and ethical issues surrounding rent strikes. We're going to talk about the theory and strategy of rent strikes. We're going to talk about what you maybe hear out of interest in COVID-19 cancel rent campaign and the sort of statewide rent strike campaign supporting that. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about organizing and preparing for a rent strike, actually starting the rent strike, defending the tenants in court, and then wrapping up the rent strike, hopefully achieving some of the goals that you've started out trying to get. And then we will be excited to answer any questions that folks have. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Bruno, who will start off talking a little bit about theory. Bruno, are you on? Boom.
Right, so I think, as Adam said, there is a long and storied history of rent strikes in New York City. They're not new. They've been dating at least to about the 1900s. I think some even have preceded that. Yeah, so next slide. Here we have one example. In 1907, a rent strike reportedly involving upwards of 10,000 families in Lower Manhattan was organized by Pauline Newman, then 17-year-old Jewish immigrant. The strike was brief, lasting only a couple months, but secured rent reduction for families, for thousands of families. I think something important to keep in mind with this example also is that, people went, as applies to the current situation, people went on rent strike in the situation not only because they had demands around, good conditions and fighting landlord harassment, but also a situation where many people just couldn't keep up with the rent. So that's something to keep in mind because it's very much salient and aligns with the situation we're going through now. So yeah, next slide.
I also wanted to add, just with this particular example, something I thought was interesting in the little article we've got excerpted here on the screen share. And it's that last paragraph there where the New York Times, I back in 2007 did, I think, a very good job reporting on like the actual dynamics of how this rent strike worked. And so they're quoting the rent strike's lawyer, and the lawyer says, "The police will execute only one eviction a day from a given house. Tenants hold from 20 to 100 families each. We will arrange that any family harbored at once by some other family. This the landlord cannot prevent, and have an endless of evictions. The landlords will accomplish nothing," which I thought was a very interesting sort of insight into their strategy there.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Adam, and it is a good tidbit to how these things have worked out in the past. Next slide.
On the next slide, Bruno. You're on, Bruno.
Okay, great. So yeah, so just have a little thing. So over here we have another example, and trying to read in through. Yeah, tenants in 109 buildings joined since court ruling, and this is about a Harlem rent strike that was organized by Jesse Gray. You can see announced about 1,500 more tenants with 109 buildings that decided to withhold January's rent. So it's about $60,000 until violations in their apartments were corrected. So I don't know what $60,000 translates into over inflation that many years ago, but you know, it's a significant amount. It's good to keep in mind, even right here, a tactic, and well, not so much a tactic, but a tool that's being implemented, which is keeping track of the rent. So I thought it was interesting, personally, as an organizer, how you have to keep track of the rent. You have to keep track of who's paying and who's not. And clearly they did here, and it had some media impact, right? So this is also an example that we'll talk about later about like the importance of a rent strike being a tactic and not a goal in of itself, and how it's important to work with the media and important to use all these tidbits of information you have to share. And thank you, Paolo, for giving us from $1,964 to today, it's roughly $700,000. So just to give you an idea of the scale that rent strikes can get, I think it's important to think about that now, because a lot of the work that we have in our housing movement now, we tend to deal with rent strikes that are, even if they become a coalition, can become at most like a portfolio of one landlord or another. And so we tend not to hear too much about big mass scale rent strikes involving large amounts of money. But it's not unheard of, and it's not impossible, and it's definitely happened before. So yes, we said before, the strike brought public attention, neighborhood slum housing conditions. That's, you know, another interesting fact. The strikers brought dead rats from their homes along into court. Adam, I don't know if you have another bit of information you want to add on this one.
I don't know what it is about these articles. I like the last paragraphs. This one, it seems like it was an editing error of some kind because it doesn't make sense in context. But there's just a quote at the end that says, "We threw cans at it," Madeline recalled. "It was a foot long, not counting the tail." And so I think people referred to this as the rat war, maybe the Harlem rat war. I will click through to the next slide now.
Yep, and then this next one, we have an example of a St. Louis tenant resolving a rent strike. So yeah, a 9-month-old rent strike in public housing ended today with a victory for the tenants. Strikers, about 1/3 of the city's 6,000 families in public housing withheld their rent, forced the resignation of the 5-man board of commissioners of St. Louis Housing Authority. And one pledged that rents would not exceed 25% of tenants' income. It's also a really wonderful example to show how rent strikes are tactics that can be applied across housing and across housing situations. You know, a lot of conversation that we've been having in this rent strike leading up, it's like how to engage people who aren't necessarily living in rent stabilized housing. And while it's certainly an issue that needs to be considered, because there's varying degrees and risks. It's also good to see examples of this one, like this one, where people have had rent strikes in situations like public housing, and not, obviously the other ones were pre-rent stabilized housing as well. So it's just good to keep in mind how rent strike is a varied tactic, various applications. Just a little caveat also here. While the 9-month strike secured several benefits for tenants, failed to prevent the deterioration and eventual demolition of the famous illegal housing developments. Adam, do you have another tidbit you want to add on that one?
No, just on that last note, it's a bit of a bittersweet note here. Some people may have heard of this whole saga with and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, with the Pruitt-Igoe housing development in St. Louis, which is a big development, but it's an example a lot of people point to as just the massive underfunding and mismanagement of public housing, and it was ultimately demolished and resulted in a lot of displacement for folks. So a successful tactic, but it's only a battle. It's not the whole war, unfortunately.
Yeah. I also want to give another example. I think we didn't have specifically a clip of it, but want to give an example that was presented by the Right to Counsel Coalition. Maybe it's in the rent strike toolkit, but just in case, just want to go over here. That one of the first rent strikes in New York City was in 1904. And it was after a successful boycott of kosher meat. Thousands of immigrant Jewish women effectively withheld rent on the Lower East Side because they couldn't afford it. So going back to the situation we talked about, it's not just been applied to getting conditions repaired and getting building services back, or fighting landlord harassment. Sometimes just literally people can't afford to pay the rent, and so they go on strike. There's also there was a housing shortage in part because 20,000 people had displaced to build the Williamsburg Bridge. Think about also how it ties into the way land use is implemented, and the way that displacement further builds pressure to for tenants to take kind of matters into their own hands. I think that also lines up with the situation we're in now. We're coming off many land use battles. We're coming off situations where people have mobilized in their neighborhoods to take ownership of how their neighborhoods will be rezoned or not rezoned, and people are a lot more conscious of the way that these efforts can displace them. In this one, it was very directly observable. 20,000 people had been displaced to build the Williamsburg Bridge. And landlords try to take advantage of the shortage by increasing the rent 20 to 30%. So the rent strikes were combined with pickets and marches, and the overwhelming majority of landlords rolled back rents, and also evictions were avoided as part of this action. Some of those tenants even won leases. So yeah, something to consider when moving forward.
Awesome. So now I'm going to take the baton and we're going to move on to the next section, which is legal and ethical considerations associated with rent striking. I'll also note something having to do with the fact that I'm trying to present and use Zoom at the same time means that I'm having trouble seeing the chat box. So maybe Bruno, if you are able to keep an eye on that chat box, and you see a relevant question that we want to address, maybe just shout it out and we'll get to it.
Yep, we'll do. The only thing we've got so far after the dollars estimate, so will also be great to have recent examples. Yeah, and we'll get into some of those too.
Perfect. So, this is legal and ethical concerns. First, let's talk about legal. As a threshold question, is a rent strike legal? The answer is a clear and uncontroversial yes. There is nothing, even with a whiff of criminal, about going on rent strike. A rent strike is basically a contract dispute. The tenant and the landlord have a contract with one another. They may be, in talks about renegotiating that contract. They may have different interpretations of that contract in terms of how habitable must an apartment be kept, things like that. And going on rent strike is one tool that the tenant has to affect the leverage, to affect the negotiation within the context of that contract dispute. And so even though a particularly frustrated landlord may say, look, in you tenants withholding this rent from me, this is a kind of theft. You are stealing this rent from me, stealing from me the income I'm entitled to. There is no legal truth to that. This is all a civil dispute. Next slide. Yes, not only are rent strikes legal, but they are actually affirmatively legally protected in New York State. And so there are a number of different places within New York law where tenants' rights to organize with one another, and even tenants' rights to, once organized, to go on rent strike together are affirmatively protected. And so we've got real property law section 230. This talks about how a landlord shall not interfere with the right of a tenant to form or join or participate in the lawful activities of a group or committee or organization to protect the rights of tenants. Landlords shall not harass or punish or penalize anybody that exercises this right. RPL, that is the real property law section 223B, prohibits landlords from commencing eviction cases in retaliation for lawful organizing activities. The next bullet point that I've got here about Article 7A of the Real Property Actions and Proceedings Law. This is one of my favorite laws, which is the thing that lawyers sometimes have. We have favorite laws. But it's this really exciting notion that was created in the 1960s, where if a third or more of the tenants in a building get together and work this certain kind of a case in housing court, then the court actually has the power to take away operation of the building from the landlord and give it to an independent administrator, so that that independent administrator can more properly maintain or repair the building. And that law contemplates tenants are going to be withholding rent and not paying it to their current landlord, so that this administrator, they can pass that withheld rent on to the administrator, and it can be more effectively used for repairs in that way. There are special parts of the housing court internal directives that speak about rent strikes and about how the court is supposed to accommodate eviction cases that arise out of rent strike proceedings, so that they can all be handled together and they can get to the core issues of the rent strike. And then I note a couple cases here where judges have said that the judge was not going to say that the tenant association wrongfully solicited money from tenants because they were simply, quote, acting as the collective body politic in the exercise of its members' rights under the statutory warranty of habitability. And then in this Schlesinger case, to deny tenants associations the right to solicit members for participation in rent strikes would be tantamount to constraining their formation and undermining their existence. And so this is very strong language supporting the rights of tenants to go on rent strike. And then in addition, sometimes what landlords have tried to do in the past is, you've got a collective rent strike, you've got maybe dozens, you've got maybe hundreds of tenants all acting together on the rent strike, and landlords, rather than commencing, 100 eviction cases, landlord says, let's bring one case in Supreme Court. Let's try to get this all done together. Maybe a court will give me an order saying the tenants aren't allowed to strike any longer. And a lot of courts have responded and said, you can't do that. That even though this is a collective rent strike, landlord, your remedy is to commence a whole bunch of individual eviction cases against the tenant. And the fact that the landlord has this obligation of commencing not one case, but potentially hundreds of cases, that is part of the economic leverage that's acting in the rent strike context. And so that'll be important. There is this case down at the bottom of this list from 1980 where at least one court ruled the other way. And so this isn't a slam dunk rule. Sometimes a court has sort of interfered with a rent strike, but that's the exception to the rule. Rent strikes are also ethical. This is perhaps controversial, but something strongly about. You know, a lot of people assign real ethical or moral significance to the idea of paying what one owes. Just as a person, you know, some believe, just as a person must take responsibility for their decisions, meet their obligations, be true to their word, so too must they pay their bills. And that's one way to look at it. And if you come at the question of rent strikes from that perspective, you're probably not going to be super supportive of them. But I think the reality is that for most tenants these days of sort of personal relationships, these personal, I don't know, one-on-one relationships with the landlord, those are long past. Landlords are distant and indifferent to their tenants' concerns. Maybe they're not even individuals, but instead they're corporations. Maybe they're owned by foreign investors or private equity firms. They're only interested in maximizing their profit. And so this is really a business transaction. And the landlord is approaching it from the angle of, you know, it's business. It's just business. I'm trying to maximize my profit. And so a tenant might think of it that way also. If a tenant is wondering, do I need to feel bad about withholding rent from my landlord? They might ask themselves some of the questions that we've got here. Do you believe that your landlord is as committed to providing you with quality services as he is to maximizing the building's profitability? If you've asked for repairs in the past, has your landlord responded promptly? Has he treated you with dignity and respect? Has his work in your apartment risen to the standards he would require in his own home? Or has he simply done the bare minimum of what he could get away with? Many buildings in shopping areas are divided among, on the one hand, long-term tenants, often people of color paying below market rents, and on the other hand, more recent tenants paying significantly higher rents. If your building fits this description, is it your impression that the landlord treats all of the tenants the same? Or is it possible that the landlord treats the tenants that are paying him more a little bit better? And then imagine that your landlord not for goods or services, but that person failed to provide. Would the landlord pay the full price out of a sense of moral obligation, or might he withhold payment until he received for it? In my experience, once they sort of work through these thought experiments, they come around to the idea that, well, maybe rent strike is a reasonable way to approach my relationship with my landlord.
And really quickly, Adam, to go back to the previous slide, I 100% agree with all that. And this is also something that's going to come up as we talk about the steps the tenant association will take in preparing for a rent strike and actually commencing one. Like, these are conversations that are had multiple times. And in that spirit, we have a question. Isn't the landlord bound by those same obligations then, if it was a personal moral thing? So maybe something to think about in that conversation. I have some thoughts on that, but I want to open up for you first, Adam.
No, I think that's exactly sort of the conclusion that, or the question that a lot of people ask as they ask themselves these questions. And I think that for most of us, no, our landlords do not worry about, are they, you know, treating us with you know, the highest standard of ethics, or is our landlord sort of allowing us to sort of keep our dignity in our interactions with the landlord? No, usually it's all business from that perspective, and you know, we're in a situation where perhaps we ought to treat it the same way.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think something that's been interesting recently is how in another presentation that we had on the current situation and as it relates to rent strikes, first is that landlords and big property owners seem to be one of the few, if not the only, business, quote unquote business, that feels it does not have to take any sort of hit during this crisis, which is really interesting to think about, because every other business has had to come to terms with, yeah, the world has changed, the situation is different, and we're gonna have to take a hit. And somehow landlords feel that they're special from that and distinct, and that very much can be like a sense of entitlement. So sometimes that narrative has changed. It's gone from being pure business to like, no, we're a family, like we've always taken care of each other, it's like I have to eat too, and it's very interesting how quickly that dynamic and that narrative will shift. But to wrap up, pass it back to Adam. I think we'll talk about this more. But I've participated in rent strikes where, on top of the fact that people very much have the sense of like more obligation to pay their bills, it's also coupled with like the nature of our capitalist system. Just people feel sometimes that the landlord just has an inherent right to the rent because they just feel it's their house, and that they have to get their money for you to be there, and that opens up a situation where you can talk about the questions that Adam went through. We also point towards the warrant of habitability. It seems like they have a right, a responsibility to maintain your home. But that question is one that needs to be addressed pretty early and often, right? And with a lot of patience, because it takes time, to have these conversations and to gradually move to a position where people can, withhold rent or, even organize against their landlord, because, sometimes people who feel that way also don't feel that they have a right to organize, period, and that's somehow inherently wrong. You need to go through all those steps. But yeah, so we'll talk more about that. Just wanted to add to that.
Awesome, thanks, Bruno. Next section here is the theory and strategy of rent strikes. Sounds very lofty. And I've just highlighted one important point right here. A rent strike is not an end in itself. It is a tactic, and it is just one of many tactics available to tenants. And this is critical to remember, because sometimes people do confuse the ends with the means when it comes to rent strike, and I think that the rent strike is sort of an end in itself. And when you start thinking that way, and you aren't thinking strategically about why am I doing this, what am I hoping to accomplish with this, then in my experience you can run into some problems, and you can certainly piss off some judges when that's the way you approach it. So absolute fundamentals. Rent strikes are about economic pressure. They're about exerting economic pressure upon the landlord by decreasing the landlord's revenue and increasing the landlord's expenses. There are basically three different factors that you play around with here in figuring out how impactful is my rent strike going to be, how much pressure am I going to be able to exert. There's first, the extent to which your rent strike is going to reduce the landlord's rent roll for this building. Second, it's how long are you able to sustain this rent strike? And third, to what extent are you able to increase the expenses borne by the landlord? And so we'll just go quickly through each of those. First, it's fundamental that the rent strike should strive to reduce the landlord's rent roll as much as possible by increasing the number of tenants involved with the strike. The more tenants recruited into a strike, the better. The owner of a 25-unit building will experience more significant pressure if a rent strike includes 20 of their tenants than if it only includes 5. And for this reason, organizing a building's tenants and recruiting as many tenants as possible to participate is a critical part of a successful strike. Another consequence of this is that rent strikes which include higher paying tenants will tend to be more powerful, will tend to exert more pressure on the landlord than those which only include lower paying tenants. And so, we were talking a little bit ago about, we're all familiar with these buildings that are sort of mixed populations of folks that have been there for a long time and have rents that are maybe regulated and at this point below market, and folks that are newer and paying significantly more in rent. And sometimes, and Bruno will maybe speak more about this, but sometimes when you try to organize in these buildings, there's a divide between these groups of people that needs to be overcome by the organizer. But it's important to just be cognizant of the fact that the more people we can bring into our tent, the more people we can bring into this association and ultimately the strike, and especially folks that are paying more or folks who maybe aren't going to have rent subsidies that are going to continue coming to the landlord even while the strike is ongoing. You're going to be able to exert more economic pressure. Second factor in determining the strength of a rent strike is the length of time over which it can be maintained. Financial month for a landlord can simply be written off, and it may not provoke a change, but where that one bad month stretches to 3 or 5, or we've had rent strikes go on for years. And where a pattern is established such that the landlord can calculate in advance how much more he's going to lose each additional month, then at some point he's going to be compelled to come to the table, and if not give the association exactly what they're looking for, give the association more than he was willing to before. And so the main way that tenants can increase the length of time that they can sustain their strike is by maintaining unity among the tenant association. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this too. Landlords will.
Yeah, just really quickly, Adam, to the queue you set up earlier. I think it's talking about the length of time that a rent strike can be maintained. Segues really well to your previous question. So yeah, you will have buildings where there's not only differences in people's time in the neighborhood and people's time in the building itself, but also just the amount of rent they're paying and the differences in their economic power. And yeah, those are definitely things that sometimes need to be overcome. We've observed these dynamics sometimes play out in the resolution of rent strikes, specifically over abatements, because obviously if you have a rent strike for a period of time and everyone's paying together, there tend to sometimes be an incentive for someone who's put more money into that rent strike just by virtue of their rent being higher to maybe want to end the rent strike earlier. And so to try to avoid situations where people have different interests, you need to have conversations really early around that. And so I think that's an example that would probably come up more as we talk about the general rent strike that's being built up for May 1st. These will get situations where people who maybe have never been in a situation needing to go on a rent strike, or people who are in rent strike on solidarity with their neighbors who maybe would have never done that, have to be cognizant of that difference in economic power, right? And so, sometimes it's just straight up, just that's how it plays out. It's also the example Adam gave that sometimes you have people who are on subsidy and not paying all of it and can only pay their portion into the rent strike account. But those are things to really be kept in consideration. It requires a lot of conversations, and buildings like sometimes what's described as solidarity, but like true unity around the transparency of the situation. Sometimes you have to get past sometimes issues of like people not wanting to share how much rent they're paying for like the feelings of shame that are attributed to it, or like the differences there. And it's important to like always lean on the common identity as renters and as tenants and be like, we are all people here living in this building who have to do this, for a collective good against our landlords sometimes. You have to just keep leaning on that. But it requires a lot of like honest conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. That's absolutely right. And so in just picking up with this slide, maintaining unity, the landlords often do work to try to divide and conquer among tenants. Maybe they'll identify somebody, they think that somebody is really a leader within the tenant association, and so they'll make an effort to peel that in the hopes that the rest of the organization will crumble. And in order to maintain the rent strike for a longer period of time and make sure that everyone ultimately benefits from it, it's going to be important that you sort of build a level of trust among the people in that group. it's going to be important that, as Bruno was saying, that the sort of things that affect the group are discussed openly and transparently among everybody, just so that everyone is just sort of is able to affirm again and again and again that we are all in this together, and no one of us is going to defect and leave the worst position. And then finally, the third factor in the economic power is, again, the expenses that are imposed upon the landlord. Now, a lot of the landlord's expenses are going to be fixed. Utility expenses, real estate taxes, mortgage payments, overhead like paying for the salary for the superintendent or whatever. But other expenses will rise and fall. And a tenant association that's doing a good job with the rent strike can make those expenses rise. The easiest one to see here is attorney's fees. If you put the landlord in a position where he has to start dozens or hundreds of eviction proceedings, he is going to have to pay his attorney to do that litigation. Legal fees are not the only expense you can increase, though. If they're able to really engage with the media, then you can put the landlord in a position where, if they want to avoid, reputational harm associated with the news running video of the rats that they're allowing to exist in their apartments, then that landlord may have to retain a firm, or may have, oftentimes we see that their expenses go up just in the sense that they need to respond to new complaints with the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or if the tenants are being good about reaching out to the government, maybe they're calling 311 all the time, then the landlord's expenses are going to be increased by those city fines. And then finally, it's important to remember that in addition to it's like a carrot and a stick situation, in addition to the stick of financial pressure or economic pressure that you're imposing on the landlord, in the well-crafted rent strike, there should also be a carrot. And that carrot should be that folks are not declining to pay the landlord and then spending that money elsewhere. Folks should be withholding that rent. And they should be able to represent clearly to the landlord that if you give us what we demand, we will pay you some or all of this rent promptly. That promise can be very helpful in getting the landlord to do what we want. That's general theory and strategy stuff. Now we're going to do a brief diversion, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with this COVID-19 hashtag cancel rent, hashtag reclaim our homes campaign. Bruno, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Adam. So as we've, mentioned a couple times before, and also, part of the, big reason for why this presentation is happening is we're in the context of this public health crisis. And one of the responses has been to both acknowledge the situation that workers are without paid jobs right now across the city, that people are sick and unable to work and provide, but also always under the underlying context is something that's been repeated many times, that the housing crisis very much existed before the COVID-19 health crisis. And so it's not just that this is a result of this health crisis, but more like to be thought of something that's compounding that already existing crisis. And that's important to recognize because a lot of the Cancel Rent campaign has been spearheaded by two very prominent coalitions here in the city. One is the Right to Counsel Coalition that has done a lot of work around passing the Right to Counsel legislation a few years ago, and now currently upon expanding it. As many of us know, many of us here on this call have been part of that. And it's also been done in coordination with Housing Justice for All coalition and campaign, which a few years ago, very successful, or last year, pushed for the implementation of new rent laws. So those two coalitions have been really pushing and spearheading this cancel rent campaign. And out of that, we've got two buckets, campaign demands, cancel rent and reclaim our homes. So just very briefly going over cancel rent, all rent, mortgages, and utility payments accrued during COVID-19 should be automatically forgiven and never owed. And while the victory for the eviction moratorium was very important early on, not only that it kept people safe in their homes, because one of the very basic principles of this health crisis as it relates to housing rights is that it's very much impossible to socially distance without your own home. And even on our end within the housing movement, we observe that social distancing is very much a privilege sometimes for people, even in homes, because as we know, many neighborhoods are overcrowded, many apartments are very dense. So people can't do that. But even so, you just essentially can't do that, and you can't be safe and healthy in this crisis without a home. The other part was that the eviction moratorium, in conjunction with the closing of housing court, meant that people didn't have to choose between staying safe or having to defend their right to their home, but going into housing court. So very important to think about. And the key components are called cancel rent. Canceling rent is universal, not subject to tenants providing proof of documentation of loss of income. There's no transfer of funds or need to apply. It's a universal cancellation of rent. Next part, this must last for a minimum of 90 days after the state of emergency ends. Full and automatic forgiveness of all utilities, including electricity, gas, water, sewage, or internet for the duration of the crisis. No late fees, surcharges, price gouging to collect higher rates, or arrears may be sent or collected by the collection agencies. And to protect renters long-term, all forms of rent hikes must be disallowed, and all tenants must have the right to renew their lease during the crisis. Big key components of quick minute. I know it's a little arduous or tedious, but thanks to people for bearing with me as I read through this. I'm just trying to be conscious of folks who are on this call via phone and may not necessarily be able to see the slides. Anything you want to add to that, Adam, unless you want to go to the next one?
No, let's keep going. I've got the next one up now.
Great. The next part of that is reclaim our homes. The demand to cancel rent must be paired with a longer-term vision of reclaiming millions of apartments as regulated social housing. Social housing that is protected from the private market, the only housing that is capable of solving the homelessness crisis. And so parts of that are urgently and permanently rehouse all homeless New Yorkers in any vacant housing with leases and/or rental support to ensure affordability. Any homeless people who are rehoused during the moment are now tenants and therefore subject to the same rights that could exist for all tenants regarding cancellation of rent utilities during the crisis. And the thought process here, as I understand it, is that there's previously been programs to house homeless people in various kinds of housing, but it results in being a sort of subcontract where the tenants themselves don't have a direct lease and don't end up having the same rights that other tenants have. I saw this in one tenant association I was working with about a year and a half ago, where people coming together in the building, but there's a difference in what people can do between the rent stabilized tenants in the same building and even people there who were formerly homeless through a program or through a nonprofit agency who was administrating that unit. And so while people had very much the same conditions building wide and services missing building wide, there's just kind of difference there. And so that component is trying to work around that, but also make sure that people certainly stay in the homes that they're in. So following up, buildings with distressed and delinquent mortgages and our taxes should be purchased by the state and converted to limited equity co-ops, community land trust ownership, investment, and permanent operating subsidies for social housing. City, state, and the federal government must work together to invest in the health of hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who call public housing home. This must include emergency operating funds to expand cleaning staff, as well as funding for repair needs to ensure healthy living conditions in the years to come. Any rent support or operating subsidies to buildings should come with ideal gold standard tenant protections, building-wide good cause evictions, and rent freeze for 2 years later, et cetera. So next slide, please. So we're on a strategy for COVID-19 rent strike. So a lot of this is based on the understanding that Governor Cuomo and the political establishment very much work for the real estate industry. This is obvious, not just in the way that they take real estate money, but in their close ties, and in the way that real estate for years in New York State has had a disproportionate say and power in lawmaking, decision-making. So to address that and to undermine that, the strategy is through targeted rent strikes and mass noncompliance with rent obligations. The campaign will create a crisis for the real estate industry, which will force Governor Cuomo to act. So the understanding here a little bit, it's similar to what Adam was going over before, that, you know, if I owe someone $5, that's my problem, but if I owe someone $5,000, that's their problem, right? So it becomes where if you take reins of the economic power in the situation and you withhold money, you're threatening their business model, and you're threatening the way, to an extent, the way they put food on their table. It's just a little dramatic example. And so that causes that creates a need that they're gonna have to respond to. They can't ignore it. And that'll build the leverage that tenants and renters across the state will need to achieve the demands they want. I think it's slightly different, and we'll get into this more, is that, as we've said, conventionally the way rent strikes are operated are through the organization of tenant associations, and that's simply just not a reality that's going to happen every single time. At least with the mass non-compliance, there's going to be a situation where people are just withholding rent on their own. There's also situations where people are organizing for the first time just around a rent strike, which is not always the case in our work with tenant associations. Rent strikes are usually a conversation, a tactic that's after, once an association has had some degree of working together previously. So moving on to the next one. Continuing. Each tenant association on rent strike will contribute to political pressure for the relief demanded by the Cancel Rent and Reclaim Our Homes campaign. In addition, each strike tenant association will apply specific economic pressure on their landlords for direct rent relief and other specific demands, which is going over what we spoke about before. Individual TAs will also have things that they need addressed in their buildings, right? So it's in some of the articles that have come up around this, there's been a lot of criticism around people saying, you know, there's going to be very difficult to do this rent strike because rent strikes in the way we've operated them kind of necessitate around the existence of conditions or harassment or services not existing in a building. And while that's certainly not something that's going to limit people's participation, it's also important to realize that it's very rare. We've not really, it's difficult to find situations where we don't have conditions, or there aren't some lack of services in the building, or there's some form of harassment going on. First reason is New York City housing stock is very old, and so a lot of things need repair anyway. And landlords, as we know, aren't going out of their way to spend money if they don't have to. So there's usually something existing anyway. So because that exists, these rent strikes will also take into account that people have specific needs in their buildings that they need addressed. Yeah. Next slide, please.
Awesome. And then just as a brief time check, all right, I'm hearing an echo. That's unpleasant. Just a brief time check. It looks like we've been talking, Bruno, for about 50 minutes, and we are on slide 27 and 56. So maybe we should
Oh
pick up
boy,
the
how did
pace
that
just a
happen?
bit.
Okay. Yeah, we're gonna pick up a bit. Okay, so yeah, so now we're getting into organizing, preparing for a rent strike. So yeah, before a rent strike can begin, a tenant association must be established in a way that can function collectively as a group. And informing the association, the tenants should decide upon internal procedures for communicating decision making. There's like two big steps here, and something I want to lean on a little towards like our organizational history on this. The first part is, like I said before, is that it's very rare for people just to, well, it's not usually the way that things form, and that the first interaction people have with their neighbors around organizing specifically to go straight into a rent strike. Usually people come together and say, look, I'm having issues. It can be around the fact that, you know, people can't pay rent or stuff like that, or having a hard time keeping up, or just the rent is too high. Something's got to be up. Like there's no way the rent is legally this high. People will come together and talk to each other. Sometimes this is very much from the presence of an organizer from day one, like door knocking a building and just being somewhere. Or sometimes people just on their own will reach out. But it's usually kind of a two-step process. People coming together, having at least one first meeting and talking collectively about what's going on, and forming some sort of idea or unity or consensus around wanting to work together. And then this conversation around strikes usually follows that up. That's not, as we've said before, that's not always going to be the case in situations. That's not always going to be the case in what we're hearing or individual tenant associations we get, but just something to keep in context. And on the other end, it's really important to build infrastructure, both around how decisions are made and how they're going to communicate. So next slide. So the first bit, how are you going to communicate? First thing you need to think about, how often is this group going to meet, right? Usually we've done it in a situation where groups meet once a month, and an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hour meeting where everything is discussed there, and all decisions are made there, but like all the information is definitely passed on there, even if it's redundant, even if people already know it. That's going to be a little difficult in this situation. People can't physically meet, shouldn't physically meet, but you can still think about picking a specific time during the week or during the month, for when everyone will get on a call, on a WhatsApp chat, just pick up the phone or something like that to meet and try to really. Next thing you think about how information and updates be shared with the group. This is a situation where usually it's an organizer with a community-based organization really kind of taking on that role. And it's, you know, it says, okay, so-and-so fulano will be the person we tell. So if something happens in the building, you pick up the phone and you let that organizer know. And that organizer might even be able to tell everyone before the meeting, but at the very least, there's someone who's collecting that info and passing it on. And the other third one, and this also expands outward. You know, how accessible is this? And when we talk about accessibility, one of the first ones is like, is it language accessible? Is interpretation needed? Does everyone speak the same language? For people who are deaf, what things do you need to make sure happen so that everyone can effectively communicate with each other and no one is left out? Thinking a little more complexly, you know, you might want to think about also just kind of guidance, not necessarily rules around how people can talk in the tenant associations. Like, you want to have a situation where there's people who, like, you know, step up and step back. Like, are there voices who are usually louder in a situation or not? Or just kind of a way to make sure that everyone is comfortable and everyone. And so second bit is decision making, right? So right here, what share of the members must agree upon or consent to a decision? So is it going to be, you know, what does majority vote look like to you guys? Is that some way you wanna think about this? How many people do you need to agree to a decision out of the group? What's the percentage before you move forward on something? Under what circumstance will decisions be made? Sometimes there's situations where tenant association needs to make a decision on the fly. That can happen with court. That can happen with a landlord making an offer to settle something, or like making an offer on abatements out of court. But decisions won't always pop up or won't always wait for tenant association meetings. So you need to decide how you can handle that. Do you appoint representatives who can kind of make decisions for everyone, or like someone in your apartment? Or what do you do in a situation where you can't get a hold of everyone? And so that's something to think about. Should the decision-making process include consensus building procedures? Decisions are made around, like, first willingness to work together, and think about that without necessarily going to a majority vote, because you sometimes will exclude some options if you necessarily go to a vote every single time from the get. And should specific matters be carved out of the group's decision-making purview? So this one, Adam, I don't know if you want to speak on that last one. That one kind of got away from me.
There are occasional situations where, you can imagine with some more ambitious or activist tenant associations, maybe there are people that want to engage in tactics that others are uncomfortable with. Maybe that's certain kinds of, direct action, like public banner drops, or maybe it's stuff that's more in a gray area, legally speaking, like eviction blockades or something like that. And a group can decide that, like, look, even though on 90% of matters, we're going to act as a unit here, and where one goes, so go we all. Maybe there's this other category of decisions where we're not going to require everybody to participate if some of us are comfortable taking risks that others are not. And so if you just sort of identify up front, are there decisions that don't necessarily need to be made collectively and individuals can do what they want to do on, then that is maybe helpful to do.
Great. Thanks for that. Yeah, so next slide.
Okay.
Right. And so once the TA has been established, there's a bunch of steps. So identify specific goals, agree on the internal procedures around a rent strike, try to get other tenants in the building to join, and communicate demands to the landlord. So on the first one, it's like, as Adam was saying, like, you'll have sometimes goals that are kind of outside of the context specifically of the building, right? So think about that specifically with this cancel rent campaign. If people are going on this, it's with the understanding that they're building power towards getting those demands across, right? In the way we've worked with TAs before, most rent strikes are commenced around, like we said before, getting repairs, building services, and rent abatements. And those are just kind of the basics, and those are goals that later become demands, and that's something we'll talk about later on, kind of the difference between the two. But things that can be goals also are, the replacement of supers, getting rid of the super if they've been particularly bad, getting new or better security measures in the building, long-term rental agreements, rental reductions, stopping the landlord from displacing people in the building. Sometimes extreme cases, tenants go on rent strike knowing that they want to get rid of the landlord and are trying to just build up enough pressure to make the landlord just say, that's it, I'm fed up, I've had it, I'm going to sell the building, or just walk away with it. And so it's important that, with these goals, as long as the TA is committed and realistic, you should, entertain those goals as something to think about. On internal procedures around the rent strike, we've always said that in a tenant association, everyone needs to go on rent strike. You can't have a situation where if there are 10 people in the TA, 9 go and 1 doesn't. That's just untenable, and that one person either needs to join the rent strike or just can't be a part of it, of the tenant association or working in that group model moving forward, because it creates a divide, right? And just the interest and the leverage, and it just doesn't, it just makes it, creates a situation where not only is the attorney unable to represent them all, unable to help, it creates a situation where the landlord can take advantage and create vision that can break apart the TA. So yeah, recruiting additional participants, that's something that the TA can think about, make a decision on. It's like, okay, we started this rent strike. Are we going to keep trying to get other people there? One important caveat, again, with the differences in leverage and economic power, is that when we've worked with tenant associations, we try to get everyone to start the rent strike at the same time. And that's to avoid a situation where you've got tenants who've been on rent strike, say for 6 months and have amassed a certain amount of money, and someone else joins that rent strike for whatever reason later and has very like a different amount of money. And so there's a different economic incentive, like maybe resolving it, settling, or accepting abatement. And you don't want that. You want to make sure that people are in the same boat as much as possible. And then next is just to decide how you're going to communicate your demands to the landlord. Adam, I don't know if you want to add anything on this slide, because it's pretty important.
No, I guess I organize this in sort of a funny way. The next slide is a quote that I like. This is Saul Alinsky, but the threat of the thing is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. And this is sort of a reminder that, when you just jump right into the rent strike before properly articulating your demands and giving the landlord the opportunity to step up and do what you have demanded that he do, your real valuable period there, where sort of the landlord has this choice, and the landlord knows, I can make things easier for myself or harder for myself. And so it is important that the demands be sort of clearly articulated in advance in order for the strike to sort of be maximally effective.
100% agree. Now we're moving on to the rent strike. I'm sorry if I just picked up the pace a little bit, Adam. I know I didn't give you the key. Move some of the slides.
No, that's perfect. I think we're back on track.
Yeah. So as I said before, a TA, you want to sit down and really think about the goals of what you're trying to achieve, just organizing in general, also around what you want the rent strike to accomplish. And some of those goals are demands, but not all of them are demands. And so the ones that are demands end up in your tenant association's demand letter to the landlord. So in the demand letter, the tenant association should have given the landlord a date by which they needed response to their demands. If that date arrives with no or inadequate response to the landlord, the strike should begin on time. And so that's really important for a couple of reasons. I always say that when thinking about working with a tenant association, a rent strike can be one of the first ways to really put unity into practice, or to build the unity. But it can also sometimes be something that'll test that unity, especially because you always want to let people know that these fights are long and that they're going to be hard. You want to be very honest about that. And in part of that, you want to make sure that the unity the tenant association has is something that can endure like a long rent strike, and challenging as it be. And so one of those very first tests is, you're like, okay, we wrote this letter, we didn't get a response, or we got a bad response, or we got, and then all three have happened in different tenant associations that I work with, or and so what do you do? Hopefully in that situation, you would already decided what you were going to do when this point comes, right? So you had the conversation previously, and you're like, okay, we're going to begin the rent strike now. And it's important to do that, to let other people in the tenant association know that you're accountable to each other, and that you are following through your commitments to each other, to let other people know that this is serious, and that we're actually what we're about, and that we're in this together. And so it doesn't become this thing which just fizzles out, right? So you have to follow through on every step you are committed to. And this is one of the very first ones that come up. Just think, okay, we sent the letter, we drafted, we put all this effort, we made a good faith effort, and nothing. So here we go on this rent strike. And the other one is, you also have to let the landlord know that you mean business, and not starting a rent strike when you say you do. Make the landlord think that you're not as organized. You're not going to be much of a threat. So yeah, next slide. So it's really important to also think about beginning the rent strike with some media outreach and direct action, right? So as we said early on, a rent strike isn't a goal of itself. You're not trying to be on it forever. And it's not like you started the rent strike, that's it, you've accomplished everything. No, it's a tactic, and this should come with other tactics, right? So things that we've done in the past, you start a rent strike and you decide, to have a rally announcing it, letting people not only on your block know that your landlord is a bad landlord, is a bad person, and it's not treating you fairly or humanely, but also you want to let the city know, you want to let other tenant activists know, you want other TAs know, and the way to do that is through the media, right? So you decide to do a rally, and that gives you an opportunity to do a few things collectively, and really start exercising the group decision-making process and the commitments you've had. So, for example, you can say, who wants to be quoted in the press release, right? So you vote on that. So do you want the attorney to have a say in the press release? Do you want your organizer, if you've got one from a CBO, to say something? Maybe do you want someone from your tenant association to be quoted in the press release? How do you decide that, right? You can't just throw it in there. So it's one of those things that you go through the mechanisms. Like, who's going to speak at the rally? What time are we gonna have the rally? All these things that can really work to really start exercising the muscle of like working together, making decisions together. Just really quickly on that. Other things that people can do as rent strikes continue is that people can continue to organize around it by giving the entire building updates on what's going on. Some TAs have printed rent strike newsletters and sent them out in their building. People put signs in their windows, sometimes letting people know that they're on strike. That's something that's already happening now. And people think, supporting rent strike, cancel rent, people are doing that already. And reasons why are obvious. It's just you want to show widespread participation in neighborhoods, trying to embarrass the landlord too, and letting people know that this is going on. So next slide. Next, it's important that tenant association establish reliable procedures for withholding the rent. These are procedures that need to be there so tenants can trust that all the participants are withholding rent as promised. The withheld money is being properly saved and accounted for, and the withheld money will only be disposed through a transparent and democratic process. So it's again pointing to all the things we've said before. Importance of a TA. The principles that keep a TA together will keep the rent strike together. So everything is done together. Everything is done in a group decision. Everyone has a say in it. And everyone has a fair share of all the information. So the first thing that's really important, and this is something that's usually facilitated heavily by an organizer, but as we said, not everyone is going to have that specific situation. But the TA needs to keep track of who's paid into the TA account, who is withholding rent. Sometimes there's a difference, how much money it is, and where it is, right? So Adam, I'll pass this one off to you in just a sec, but I just want to emphasize how important it is to write down everything. And you also have to make sure that you've decided how people are going to collect it, right? Is this going to happen at the monthly meeting? Usually that's what happens. In this situation, it's not as easy. And so people are going to have to find ways to do that and make sure they check in with each other. How is that money now collected going to go into the tenant association? Who's going to do that? What's the process through which that money can be withdrawn, right? So you want to have signatories for that, at least 2 in your tenant association, but there can be more. Who's going to hold on to the checkbook? Usually want that to be someone who's not the signatory. Just logistics. What day is all this going to go down on the month, and how is it going to get to the TA account? So yeah, I'll pass it quickly to Adam How much time would you need to add on to this?
Sure. And so I'll just speak briefly on this. I don't know if I'm hearing myself through you, Bruno. Maybe mute yourself just for a second.
Yeah, that could be.
So in the chat a minute ago, there was or I guess now an hour ago, there was a link shared for a COVID-19 rent strike sort of legal support guide. And in that, we actually wrote up a little bit more detail about the way that rent strikes get their tenant association accounts set up to receive the rent strike funds. But it's basically like Bruno noted, most tenant associations don't end up, at least with us, don't end up using attorney escrow accounts. Instead, the association itself, as under the law, they're just sort of an unincorporated association. They can go to the bank, they can open up an account for the association, and then identify their certain signers, get the checkbook, and keep the money in there. The structures that they need to set up are a sort of separation of powers, which ensure that the power over the money in this checking account is well distributed amongst different people, so that there is less chance for sort of individual opportunism, which can be really, it almost never happens, but when it happens, it can be utterly devastating. My next slide is something that I just saw today, but this is apparently, at least allegedly, a guy that was an accountant for a rent strike fund and ran away with almost $2 million in 1990 of the tenant association's money. And I don't have the whole article reprinted here, but it is no surprise to learn that when just this massive amount of withheld money for these tenant association members went missing, that was devastating for the members of that association. So it's very important that procedures be set up so everyone can have just complete confidence that when they deposit their money, that money is going nowhere. And so again, check that resource guide, and there's some more information on more on that, Bruno, or you wanted to move to the next section?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say thanks for that. I think, yeah, let's move on to the next section, which is also yours.
Great. Is defending striking tenants in court. And this is, it shares a lot in common with individual non-payments because in a bunch of non-payment cases are the way that the rent strike issues typically themselves in front of judges. Just briefly jump through some of these differences here. First, a word about lawyers. I guess the poll revealed that several of us on this call are lawyers, but for those of you that are not, it's worth considering as early as possible with rent strike. This is because they can advise you on what the legal process is going to look like. They can talk to you about how to put your communications with them together in such a way that it's going to trigger obligations for the landlord, and it's going to avoid saying something that's going to make the tenant's cases in court more difficult later on. You can imagine, particularly frustrated tenants saying, you know what, I don't care if you do the repairs, I'm never going to pay you any money. And those are the sorts of letters that when they get in front of judges, they can undermine the credibility of the association, the validity of the strike. And so it can be helpful to have sort of an attorney around to talk through some of those issues. Also, make sure that everybody has a good sense of, what documents should you be saving? Proof of bad conditions, proof of communications with the landlord, information about how they receive court process, things like that. The second paragraph, though, is as important as the first, which is that sometimes you get situations where lawyers come in and they start running the show, and that's inappropriate. Lawyers are involved with these rent strikes in sort of a purely advisory, supportive capacity. It is 100% the members of the tenant association, through their own internal decision-making procedures, that charting the course for this rent strike with the assistance of the tenant organizer. And the lawyers are there as a resource. It looks like I just discussed all this. So yeah, rent strikes, again, when they are litigated, that is to say, when they finally arrive in court, they almost always take the form of individual non-payments brought by the landlord against some or all members of the tenant association. Because they are non-payment proceedings, they are going to share a lot in common with the sorts of individual non-payment proceedings that a lot of tenant lawyers have a lot of experience with, but they're going to be different in a few key ways. First, it's important to, with a rent strike, unlike perhaps with an individual non-payment case, time is on your side. Like, time is something that you are trying to expand. You're trying to make the rent strike go on for longer rather than a briefer period of time. And because of that, you may litigate the case differently. You may make certain procedural motions that tend to make a case take longer. You never do, obviously we all know that under our ethical obligations, you must never do things that are sort of for the pure purpose of delay, but tenants are free to assert their substantive and procedural rights and make non-frivolous motions that have as a consequence the lengthening of the rent strike. And then second, it's important to think through, both as a lawyer and as the tenants in the association, the connection between these group non-payment court dates and the rising efforts and the media advocacy of the association. There's nothing like a court date where you can say, 50 tenants are going to be in court on Tuesday. There's nothing like that to like give the media a hook, which tells them, oh, this story needs to be written now rather than 3 weeks from now. And so it's important to think through all that stuff. So because there's this organizing value, and because it's just convenient for the group and for the lawyers working for the group, it's a good idea to always try to get the non-payment cases, which again are brought individually, to get them all consolidated together so that they're in the same courtroom, they're in front of the same judge, they typically have the same court dates. And so that idea is called consolidation. You can do it a couple of different ways. The way that we have been doing it recently is you can actually put in the answer a notice to the court clerk and saying, clerk, these cases arise out of a common rent strike. And under the directive that I cited earlier, DRP 150A, under that directive, the clerk of the court is supposed to override their automatic assignment court system and assign all those cases together in front of the same judge. And so that can make the consolidation a lot easier down the road, because in front of the same judge usually has no, putting the cases all on the same day. Also, for some reason you get separated, you can make a motion to consolidate the cases. And as authority for that motion, you would cite Section 110B of the Civil Court Act, which says that housing court cases that arise with respect to a single building are supposed to be consolidated upon the request of a party, unless there is, quote, good cause that they should not be consolidated. And with a rent strike, there are just so many common issues that it's almost always appropriate to consolidate. Because we understand that the economic pressure put against the landlord increases with time. You might do some things in defending a rent strike case that you wouldn't necessarily do in an individual non-payment case. You may make a big deal out of your Travers defenses and try to do a whole hearing over whether or not the papers were served properly. We all know that doesn't make the cases go away permanently. Best case, it gets these cases dismissed and the landlord then has to refile. And so if you're trying to solve the fundamental, with an individual tenant, you're trying to solve a fundamental problem of non-payment, that doesn't necessarily help you a huge amount. But here, because we want the strike to become powerful, it does make sense to raise some of these technical defenses. Other technical defenses are, stuff like failure to register a building with the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, failure to name a necessary party, failure to just technical failure to plead the necessary elements in court papers, etc. Obviously, with respect to most rent strikes, which again are most often, I think, brought because of reasons of bad conditions and tenant harassment, it's going to make sense to raise all of your defenses around warranty of habitability, which is basically the argument that I should owe less money, I should receive an abatement of rent because there are bad conditions. You can raise defenses sounding in the existence of quote unquote rent impairing violations, which can be in some cases a complete defense to rent being owed. You can also make counterclaims for trying to get repair orders against the landlord, and that can have an added bonus of sort of shifting the momentum in the case in the tenant's favor. We're not here just to talk about how I owe the landlord rent. Instead, we are here to talk about how the landlord owes me these repairs, and that change in emphasis can, produce some happy outcomes with the judge. Obviously, it's because, again, part of the desire is to use these consolidated court cases as an organizing vehicle, as a sort of a focal point for media and other direct action. One thing you want to think through is, will a given litigation strategy have a tendency to split these cases up and put them in different situation, or join them together and have them function more like a single case? It can be great if you've got a situation where you've got like really bad conditions in the common areas of the building, because those defenses apply equally to all of the tenants. And so everyone is really similarly situated. And that can be really helpful from sort of an organizing unity perspective. Oh, this is what I just talked about. Great. Use upcoming dates as a hook for media engagement. You can consider on a common court date, you can consider holding a rally outside the courthouse. You can invite elected officials to come support their constituents at your press conference or in the courtroom. They can just sort of be in attendance, and often judges notice that sort of thing. That is the gist of the litigation stuff. And then resolving a rent strike. There's not much in this section, but because a rent strike, again, usually turns into non-payment eviction cases, one question that these cases may, that the lawyers and the tenant association may have to decide at some point is, how fundamentally do we want to resolve this? Do we want to come to a settlement agreement where the landlord maybe agrees to make some repairs, agrees to, provide us renewal leases on certain terms, and we agree to pay a certain amount of rent on a given timeline? Or do we want to leave it all to the judge and just go to trial and see what the judge orders? This can be a complicated question because a lot of tenants have really negative associations with the idea of settlement with this person or this entity that they have spent maybe months demonizing and focusing on how this is a bad person who does not have my interests at heart. And so isn't a settlement capitulation? Isn't it giving up? And these can lead to some really intense discussions within the association. The other side of that argument is that a settlement agreement is not, if it's a good settlement agreement, it's not necessarily capitulation. It is sometimes the fruit of your organizing effort. Sometimes getting the landlord to agree to things above and beyond what we would be able to get from a judge is itself the victory. And so sort of having that discussion and articulating these different frames for what settlement means can sometimes be a process. Typically, settlement agreements involve some sort of agreement to pay some amount of rent. Usually that amount of rent is reduced in light of the conditions of disrepair or the harassment or what have you. Oftentimes it's to agree to pay that money by a certain date, but sometimes it's made conditional upon the landlord taking certain steps. It's not unusual to have an agreement that says, the tenant's going to pay by July 1 assuming that the landlord makes repairs A, B, and C at least 2 weeks before then. If not, we'll all come back to court and continue to duke it out. And then finally, this is, I think, a critical point. Remember that settling a given rent strike is not the end of the road. The rent strike is one tactic in a whole basket of tactics, and it's more akin to a battle than it is to the entire war. Bruno and I have worked with tenant associations that, maybe in 2014 they went on a rent strike, and after a successful strike, they got a big reduction in rent, and they agreed to pay the landlord some money, and they ended the strike. And then 6 months later, the landlord was up to his old tricks again. And so, you know what? They start withholding again. The settlement of the strike is not, it's not the end. And you can sometimes folks, upon reflecting on that fact that this is just one part of the fight's going to go on maybe forever. Reflecting on that can sometimes, grease the wheels to thinking a little bit more creatively about like what is a reasonable goal for right now versus what is the, what is my dream goal at the, when kingdom comes. And then finally, Bruno sort of gave another angle on this quote, but it's a quote that I like, that I think says something fundamental about rent strikes. This idea, this dual nature of debt. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. The idea that through allowing these debt obligations to accumulate, we can actually obtain a real stick to wield against the landlord, or I guess in the context of the quote, the bank. That is a very powerful idea to me. And so that was our presentation. And now I think we're eager to hear any questions that you guys have, unless Bruno, you want to add some stuff to the bit about court or resolution.
Yeah, I'll just really quickly on that. Yeah, I agree with you that you have to remember that it's not the end in and of itself. And sometimes that could also be like, you end the rent strike knowing that you ultimately are trying to get rid of the landlord maybe, and so you're like, okay, cool, end that one, start another one almost immediately. Keep on putting pressure on the landlord, and just understanding that it's a continuous process. Yeah, always, I think, something we always said, it's a long fight, and as you work long and long with the TI, remind them like this is the struggle. This is what it is, and tenants will always have to assert their rights, and if you don't assert your rights, then you're going to be in trouble. And so that you have to kind of understand that this is sometimes a forever thing. Just a little context.
All right, thank you guys so much for presenting. Everyone's still muted, so I'm gonna clap on behalf of everybody for you guys. Let's take a 5-minute break. I've written down some questions. I think I have about 6 right now from the chat. But everyone, let's just take a 5-minute break. Let's reconvene at 3:50. I had to do math. 3:50, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. So go ahead, use the bathroom, stretch, and we'll be back. Okay, everyone, start gathering back. I hope you enjoyed that little break, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. So I have some questions written down here. There's about 6 of them, but please feel free to write in the chat box whatever question that you have. I believe that everyone here. Okay, so everyone is muted, but you do have the opportunity to unmute yourself. So if you do want to say something, you can press the unmute button, or you can just write in the chat box. But definitely let's try to use the one mic. And another thing that I think is really important is if everyone can turn on their videos, just so we can see you and, be social again. Zoom kind of keeps us apart, but that's what these cameras are for, right? So let me go and start off with the first question. I guess these will be for either you or Bruno. Adam or Bruno, you can both answer this. if you have anything to say about it. So the first one would be, what about retaliation from the landlord? So I guess what do you have to say if a landlord retaliates against tenants that are going on a strike?
Well, retaliation is sort of an interesting issue with respect to rent strikes, because I guess the question would be, what form does that retaliation take? If the landlord tries to retaliate in the sense of like, oh, you're going to go on rent strike, I'm going to cut off your heat, that's categorically illegal. I recommend to those tenants, that they report it right away to 311. If they've got legal counsel involved, or even if they don't, they can file HP proceedings with the housing court, try to get that taken care of. Sometimes folks conflate non-payment proceedings with retaliation, though. And that, I guess it's true in a sense, but really it's the inevitable response to a rent strike. If you go on rent strike, it is almost 100% likely that you are going to end up sued and brought to housing court for non-payment. So that it depends on the kind of retaliation to determine what exactly your options are.
Bruno, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with Adam. It's important to think about the differences. I would add that if it results in loss of services, or the landlord retaliates by breaking something in the common area or in someone's apartment or something like that, or starts, harassing you, like threatening someone, saying nasty stuff, 100% call 311. That in of itself becomes an opportunity for tenants to organize. So it's like, okay, everyone is going to call 311 every day about, or once a day, about the fact that there's no heat, right? So we're all in this together. We all committed to do things together. It's not just going to be person A or person Z calling. It's going to be all 10, 15, 6 people in the building calling together. So that's one of the ways you can think about that also. Just to add to Adam, and usually the way we've worked with our tenant associations, you go on rent strike, Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of very much hoping or expecting that you get taken to court, because going to court is an added expense for the landlord, more money out of their pocket, and increases the economic pressure. I think that gets tricky in situations where people are on rent strikes without representation. So I don't know if you want to add any last bit to that before we move on.
Yeah, I guess as I took 10 more seconds and thought about the question a little bit more, there is like a gray area between the two examples I gave of a non-payment proceeding, which the landlord is definitely allowed to do, and you're almost provoking him to do it, versus cutting off your heat, which the landlord is never allowed to do. And there might be a category like, what if you're an unregulated tenant and the landlord was going to renew your lease, but then decided not to after the rent strike? Or maybe a year ago, before preferential rents were basically permanent under the HSTPA, what if you have a preferential rent but the landlord decides to take that away because you went on rent strike? In each of those situations, it's going to be a fact-intensive inquiry. My belief is that you're going to be able to push back against those, and you're going to be able to fight that in court. And I think if you can establish that the motive, the reason why the landlord did that was because you were engaging in this tenant association activity, I think I'd want to do more research, but I think you'd have a good chance at shutting that down.
That's really interesting. Thank you. All right, next one. How many tenants, how many tenants in one building have to withhold rent to get a rent strike to be considered a true rent strike? So I guess that would also depend on like how many units are in the building. But I guess, what do you guys have to say about that?
Yeah, I think you want, it's you want the majority, right? Or you want at least half, definitely in your tenant association as you're organizing, definitely on a rent strike. The scale that gets trickier, the bigger the building gets, right? So in a 6-unit building, you definitely want everyone involved because it's achievable. 100 or 50-unit building, That's tough. What do you think, Adam?
I think there are different ways to answer the question. I mean, for me, it's really all on a spectrum. You know, we talked in the theory and strategy section about how the more the landlord's rent roll is impacted, the more power that strike is going to have, the more economic pressure it's going to be able to impose. And so just that principle operating says that one tenant by himself going on rent strike in a 100-unit building is going to be very weak relative to 100 tenants going on rent strike in that building. In any place you draw the line between them, you're sort of making different judgments. I guess the guidance that the Housing Justice for All and the Right to Counsel coalitions have given on this COVID rent strike is that the rent strikes they're supporting, they'd want ideally to be half the building and at minimum to be a third of the building. I think that third of the building figure is also sort of interesting because that's the amount of the building that you need in order to bring a 7A proceeding, which sometimes happens at the same time as a rent strike. And so I'd say having more than a third is ideal, but certainly the more the better.
Thank you. So the next one, how does size of building affect the advisability of rent strike and vulnerability of the tenants, especially if most of the tenants are striking out of solidarity? And I guess we can just assume that this question is for unregulated tenants, or maybe if you want to explain what the differences would be for regulated, like rent stabilized tenants, or unregulated market rate apartments.
Sure. So yeah, I guess obviously some people on this call are going to know all about this, but in New York City, as a general rule, buildings with fewer than 6 units are most often not regulated. And so tenants in a 4-unit building or a 2-unit building are not going to have certain protections that tenants in bigger buildings may have, although not every tenant that lives in a 100-unit building is rent stabilized. A lot of them are not. The more of these protections that a tenant has, the more they are sort of inoculated against holdover proceedings. And so the landlord's not simply going to be able to terminate people's tenancies and evict them and end the strike that way. And so you sort of force the landlord into this course of action of pursuing you for non-payment. For that reason, I'd say definitely rent regulated tenants, their strikes can be more effective in that sense, and they can have a little bit more security. The flip side of the coin, and I hate to answer all these questions with other sort of questions, but the flip side of the coin is that smaller landlords are often more economically vulnerable. If somebody just owns one 5-unit building, it may be that they do not have big cash reserves to continue paying their mortgage and operating that building for 6 months without revenue. And so in that sense, maybe there is some more economic pressure that can be exerted in a small building rent strike.
Great. How important is it to establish a building-wide rent strike escrow account, and how to consider the balance between necessity and solidarity strikers in making deposits into that account? I guess this would be a question for the both of you.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it first. I think, as we've said, I think it's essential. The caveat there also is, I think we've talked about this before in other meetings and maybe other presentations. Like it's difficult to open up a tenant association account right now in the circumstances, accessibility of the banks or whatnot, to get all the money together. But in every rent strike that I've worked with, you definitely have a TA account. maybe Adam, you can go a little bit into the difference between a TA account and an escrow account. But you need it for all the reasons we went through before. It's really essential. People need to be able to trust that their money's not just going to get run off with. We'll need a mechanism to pay into together and to work on together. Dividing the responsibilities also increases the engagement, so people feel more committed to each other, but also like it's the tenant's thing, right? It's like, even for organizers, if the organizer doesn't live there, the organizer's secondary, right? So it's because the organizer's not going to get evicted, thrown out at the end of the day, right? So tenants should be able to be hands-on in these kind of things, and the TA account is really very much one of those. So I would say, like really, really essential. That'd be my answer. And how to consider the balance between necessity and solidarity strikers. I both need to pay into that account, because especially, if you're anticipating going to court, you're going to need that there. But I'm not quite sure. Maybe I misunderstood the question. So maybe after Adam's answer, if there could be some clarity on that, if it needs to be.
Sure. And so again, it's going to be all ambiguity with me. I think Bruno's absolutely right that as far as what I'm going to maybe unjustifiably call like a traditional rent strike, the sort of rent strikes that Bruno and my organizations have been doing, for years and years and years, it is, essential that there be a collective account, either an attorney escrow account or a tenant association checking account that holds all that money in order to both to like make sure that folks don't, accidentally spend it rather than withhold it, and just give the group that additional proof that they are still all on the same page, that we are all still withholding. If you do not withhold in the collective account, it can be devastating to a rent strike sometimes, because if at the end of the day you've been on rent strike for a year, and then somebody comes forward and says, I haven't saved any of the money, and so they're not allowed to, they're not in a financial position to comply with the settlement that the group might have wanted to do, it can cause real problems, and it can devastate the leverage that group might have had. Now, here's the big issue is what about these COVID rent strikes that we were talking about now, where this is not in most of these folks' cases, this is not like a deliberate choice. This is a necessity. We are not working. We are not making money. We do not have the money. So what then? And with the COVID rent strikes, it's going to be very interesting to see how these function. And in a lot of ways, they're not going to function quite like these other traditional rent strikes do, because what if what if the landlord comes back and says, I'll make each and every repair that you may have written about in a demand letter? Well, we still can't pay. That's not the whole issue. And our demands are as much for the state as they are for the landlord. And so in these cases, I think there is still value in those folks that do have the money but are striking in solidarity with others. I do think there is still value for them to have a tenant association account to deposit their money into. It's going to be a little bit trickier to come to a group agreement about how that money is going to be directed and under what circumstances it's going to be paid and things like that, because it is just the money of some of the members rather than all of them. And so those are going to be some interesting agreements to work out that I can't really make concrete recommendations on at this point.
Yeah, I want to add to that now. As I reread and heard you talk about it, I understand the question better. I agree. Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. There's not guidance on that from before on exactly how to do that. I think a lot of what's been helpful for me to think through on this is that if you're saying you're in solidarity, that means you're in solidarity and true unity. So I guess if it's a position where you weren't at risk necessarily of not being able to pay your rent before, this is where the conversation around the goals of the tenant association and the rent strike really come into play. And when you're like, okay, what's the point, and really gaming it out, when's the point when we stop the rent strike and when we continue? And you have that conversation. Is an abatement enough? Is the repairs enough? And from many instances with the COVID strikes, it won't be, because, you know, as Adam said, people still can't pay. But you need to be straightforward about that, and you need to have that conversation, and people need to honor those commitments and those agreements moving forward. It can't be like 8 months down the line, you're like, okay, I'm tired, this is really long out, we've been going to court, or it's like, it's just been a long fight, I just want out. And if there's no relief, God forbid, for people by then, you can't just bail on them either, because they started this understanding that you were going to have their back. And that's where I guess the nitty gritty. But like, that's why it's important to have those conversations early, and to be mindful of you know, the commitments that people are making internally. But as to exactly how that's going to play out, I once again, I agree with Adam. That's uncharted territory, and it's going to be, yeah, people are going to be figuring that out as they go.
Thank you. Next question we have: how important is it to establish a building-wide rent strike escrow account, and how to consider the balance? Oh, I already said that, right? Sorry. If the goal is for all rent to be canceled, what demands should be made of individual landlords in an initial demand letter?
And so there are two interrelated questions there that I'll try to parse out. One of them is like, what should our actual goals be vis-a-vis the landlord? And then there's another question, like, what demands are we going to put down? Even if folks are starting the strike for financial reasons, I think I and any attorney they talk to is going to tell them that, well, if you're going on rent strike, it's going to be helpful to you to identify any repair issues that need to be addressed. Because even if you didn't otherwise care that you've got a window that doesn't, you know, that falls down, or that one radiator doesn't work, or whatever, even if you weren't otherwise going to bother with getting the landlord to fix that, that could still be a defense to some part of the rent that you're going to, you know, that you might end up owing. And so you should make sure that you take this opportunity to give the landlord notice about all this stuff in the demand letter. And it can be helpful to sort of frame the demand in part around those conditions. I think in terms of like the actual goal with respect to the landlord, some of the tenant associations are framing that goal in terms of like a percentage rent reduction. You know, we would like 50% off of our rent for the months of April, May, and June. And they're making demands that are a little bit short of complete rent cancellation, but still would be something that their members would be able to pay, and that would be a big improvement over the status quo.
Can you all talk a bit about what settlements or other resolutions look like when there is no money to pay, like with the current COVID-19 rent strike strategy?
You want to take a stab at this, Bruno, or do you want me to try?
I didn't quite understand the question. I was also going back. I want to, there was another part of the question we answered just before about, yeah, very similar about the carrot. Like, what's the carrot for folks if, so I was just reading through that. I want to make sure we get to that. But Kayla, can you say that question again? And I apologize.
Okay, so can you all talk a bit about what settlements or other resolutions look like when ostensibly there is no money to pay, like with the current COVID-19 rent strike strategy?
I mean, my thinking on this is that if there's simply an inability to pay, then settlement is not really going to be something that happens for a lot of these folks. That settlement is something that the landlord agrees to when they are getting something out of that deal. And if there's nothing for them to be gained from settlement, they're not going to do it. Now, it may be that with some like mixed tenant associations where a certain number of people are sort of completely without money, but are continuing to draw their full salaries. And maybe that there are creative arrangements there where sort of through the participation of the solidarity strikers, deals can be hashed out saying, if you cancel rent for all of the folks that don't have jobs, the folks that still have jobs will pay what they owe. That's a deal that I could see working out in some situations. But I think for a lot of these groups, folks are going to end up going to trial. And as they go to trial, they will be trying to assert new creative defenses that we haven't really had the need or the opportunity to assert before. Things like in law school, you learn about force majeure, this idea of some mighty force from heaven coming down completely out of the blue and making the contract seem sort of completely out of place. This idea that nobody saw COVID coming, it's prevented tons of people from working, it's endangered the health of tons of people. The contract did not anticipate this, and so we're going to be making creative arguments that the court should waive rent in those circumstances.
Yep.
That's really
So yeah, I think adding a little bit to that, this highlights back to why it was important to go through the goals of the cancel rent demands and the reclaim home demands, and also why it was important thinking about when you're beginning organizing a tenant association, beginning of a rent strike, you very much go through your goals, right? So going back to what we said before, so I can't really speak to settlement. And Adam already did that. But as far as resolution, I think what you're trying to do, and I think what's understood is that if you're organizing the tenant association, the rent strike in direct response to a public health crisis affecting housing for everybody, then it's under the understanding that you're going to be in alignment, right, with the goals of cancel rent and reclaim homes. So the way all the different buildings play into that is still that structure is still being figured out. Part of it is going to be led by some buildings that are in partnership with community-based organizations, and they're going to have a big say in how that breaks down and how the decision making and the strategy around that figures out. But I think people should understand that to some extent they're in alignment and they're going to be following the larger campaign through, right? So that means going back to what Adam said, I think, yeah, it's the goal is to cancel rent, right? Mm-hmm. So the resolution is when rent is canceled. And, Adam went to a really nitty-gritty example. It's like if you get rent canceled for your building, but not the whole city, what happens? I mean, that's what I'm thinking, like what happens there. And that's not for me to say. But those are important things to think about and things that people should talk about early. But yeah, the resolution is cancel rent, and so people should stay in it until they feel like rent is canceled.
In terms of the carrot and stick approach, if this rent strike is inspired by the financial devastation of COVID-19 and in the knowledge that folks can't pay, what is the carrot here?
Yeah, and I think we both got to that a little bit with the last question, and the reality is that with respect to some of these tenant associations, there may be no carrot. I guess you could imagine ways that it might work. If you stretch out the timeline, if the rent strike goes on for a year and a half, maybe these strikes go on even longer than they otherwise would, because the court is going to be so over capacity once it reopens, and because they're still going to be trying to practice social distancing, and so they're going to schedule court dates further apart. You can imagine a situation where maybe somebody has lost their job now, completely has no money to pay, April through July, but then maybe gets their job in August, and so begins at that point putting money away. And when they're finally in front of a trial judge next August, and the situation is the landlord's asking for 15 months and the tenant has 12, at that point, settlement has become possible again, even though there was a complete inability to pay for a period of time.
All right. How can you get media attention without placing yourself at risk of retaliation if you're not able to organize with neighbors for an actual tenants association in your building?
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I think that one's tricky, right? Because one of the things we always talk about with our tenant associations is that there's safety in numbers, right? And so that means that the actions you take farther down the road are therefore make sense as a group in ways that they didn't necessarily make sense individually, right? So, you know, it's really hard because you are at more risk. So I would say, what's the goal of the media attention, right? You kind of have to think that one through first. And the example I could give there is that you can add to the media attention that the general rent strike needs to build the power citywide by plugging into like coalitions like, you know, House Just for All and Right to Counsel, who are constantly looking for tenant stories, right? So they're like, hey, we need people to tell us why they're going in this, like we need to demonstrate this need, right? So you can reach out to them and then talk about your story, and it could, you know, it can add to the media attention, and you can be part of that narrative. But I'm not necessarily sure that it will give like an immediate return in the specific situation of that person giving their account, right? It's like, I don't, the landlord might not hear about it, etc. So that might be a safe way, but it might not give the return that you're looking for. You know, another kind of thing in general to think about is, you know, you're sometimes, you know, we use media attention sometimes to kind of abate some risk. So in buildings that I've worked with where landlords have engaged in construction as harassment, which is to say that they're doing illegal construction, unsafe construction, the whole building will come together and do a rally, because then that landlord won't want to keep doing that construction and sending in workers with media present, right? Or knowing that like people paid attention to the building, keeping their eye on it, because they're going to get caught, right? And so that kind of abates that risk a little bit. But if you're on your own, you know, it's not as safe. It really just goes back to the goal of what you're trying to accomplish. So yeah, it was ambiguous. I don't know, Adam, do you want to add in a little?
I think you hit all the points that I would have hit. I mean, if you are one person in a building, I think you would have difficulty getting in a special amount of media attention on your own particular situation, and I'm not sure I would advise that you try. I think that, as Bruno suggested, if you like hook in with some of these broader coalitional groups that aren't necessarily building specific, you sort of add yourself to their numbers, and that is both going to be more successful at getting media on this campaign, and it's going to preserve you some measure of anonymity.
All right. So that's all the questions that we've had from the list. Would anybody else like to add a question or have any comments, anything that they'd like to say about the presentation? Like I said, feel free to write in the chat box or unmute yourself. But I just wanted to thank you guys again for setting this presentation up for us and taking time out of your day to teach us all about this. I have one question. So if this whole argument of I lost my job during the because of the pandemic, so when we're on the hotline, we get a lot of calls from people who have actually fallen into arrears before the pandemic even started. So would they be able to, like, how do you think, how successful their cases for non-payment would be in housing court if they fell behind before the pandemic started? For them to argue.
It's usually not all or nothing in housing court. I mean, if we find that that there is some traction to these new defenses that we're thinking through, unique to the COVID crisis, then I would think that defense would still be viable against some portion of their arrears, even if not all of it. And they should, you know, still take what steps they can now to to get all lined up on potential defenses like that. Because again, it may take these cases a long time to get sorted out in the overcrowded housing court. And that may have allowed them, the time to do a good amount of catching up.
And if any of the folks here actually live in North Brooklyn, what is the best way that they can contact Communities Resist or getting, join your organization?
So we're a new organization as of last year, and we're just finishing our website rollout, I think, in the next few weeks. So we don't even have a website yet. We do have a Facebook page. So you can look for us on Facebook, Communities Resist. And then we have a phone number, which is 646-974-8761. Is that right, Bruno?
Yep, that's the right number. I have it up here on my phone. You can, definitely find us on Facebook. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter. I want to highlight another resource we have bi-weekly on Wednesdays. We have a info session presentation call-in, kind of similar to this one, just a little shorter. We don't get too much into as much nitty-gritty, but it's for people who can call in with questions about what's going on. Like, people still have questions about the eviction moratorium, about, stuff like that. So that's a resource. You can find that definitely in our Facebook. It'll be advertised. It's also a Zoom call. So it's not the only time that you can get in contact with us. If you can't do it through the phone or don't have time, you can log in, and that's usually 7 to about 8:30. Presentation at the beginning and then Q&A at the end. It's really worth it. And it's in bilingual. It's bilingual. So.
Great. We should definitely add that to some of our resources, actually. So if there are no any questions, any final comments that our presenters would like to say, and please, everyone, just give a round of applause to our presenters for that lovely information that they gave us. I'm clapping along.
I just want to thank you, Kayla, and Housing Court Answers, for putting this together. It was a pleasure to talk with you today. And then also, I just want to shout out once again the work that the Right to Counsel Coalition is doing around this rent cancellation campaign and around putting together these great sort of written resources for tenants that are all available on their website. And so if you're interested in digging in deeper on this rent strike campaign, there are good written resources up there.
All right, folks, thank you so much. Like I said, this training has been recorded. In the next few days, you can find it on our website, housingcourtanswers.org/events, if you need to go back at it, if you'd like to share it with anybody. And definitely stay tuned for our spring training series. You're always welcome to come.